Good afternoon. I'm Linda Jacobs, Director of Development at the American Philosophical Society. I'm pleased to welcome so many of our friends of the APS for our annual New Acquisitions presentation by Associate Director of Library Collections, David Gary. Friends of the APS provide critical, unrestricted support that allows a society to allocate the funds where they're needed most. Last year, generous gifts from the Friends allowed us to convert all of our programs to a virtual platform, support scholars and researchers working remotely, and install new air filtration systems in all of our buildings, ensuring our continued safety when we gather in person. Thank you. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. With roots extending back to the founding of the Society in 1743, the Library of the American Philosophical Society houses over 14 million manuscripts, 350,000 volumes and bound periodicals, 250,000 images, and thousands of hours of audio tape. The library's holdings make it among the premier institutions for documenting early American history, the history of the sciences, and Native American ethnography and linguistics. Our Center for Digital Scholarship promotes our holdings through digitization, digital humanities, and the development of innovative library discovery tools. Our speaker today, Dave Gary, is responsible for building, interpreting, and caring for the Society's collections of books, pamphlets, broadsides, maps, and ephemera. In 2019, he managed the move of the David Library of the American Revolution's collections from Bucks County to the APS. At present, he's an integral part of the installation of new compact shelving in the lower levels of the library. This is a project that we've wanted to do for some time and was made feasible with the closure of our buildings due to the COVID pandemic. Dave received his PhD in early American history with a focus on the history of the book from City University of New York Graduate Center. And he brings to the Society's acquisition efforts a deep well of knowledge, keen intellect, and expert eye. Many of the works in the library's collection and that you'll see today have come to the Society as gifts from generous and public-minded members and friends. Other works are purchased through Dave's networks of dealers or acquired at auction. Before Dave begins his presentation, I want to remind you that this talk is being presented in webinar format, so you're all muted. To take advantage of the closed captioning, please click on the CC button on the taskbar, which for many of you is at the bottom of your screen. I invite you to submit questions to Dave for discussion at the conclusion of our talk, and you can submit questions using the Q&A button at any time. Once again, thank you for your support and enjoy the talk. Dave?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Linda, for that wonderful introduction. And before I get too further along, I want to make sure I thank Jake and Alexis for helping with all the arrangements to get the Zoom set up so we can all have this discussion virtually. And also want to thank all of my listeners for listening in today. I'm hoping that you enjoy all the things I picked. We've collected a lot of material over the past year. I had to make some pretty difficult selections in terms of what I was going to show you. I could show many things for many hours, but I cut it down to a list of 13 different items that I think that you'll enjoy. Happy to answer any questions after all this is done about any one of them. But before I roll into the material, I just want to give a quick 1-minute introduction to the Society, especially for some of the friends who might be a newer member of the Friends group. So the American Philosophical Society's mission is to promote useful knowledge, and we do that through four main ways. One is our membership. We have about 1,000 elected members, and these are people at the very top of their game, people in the sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and arts and affairs. Many of these people give us material for the collection, both books and manuscripts. We've had generous donations from members throughout the year this year, including Alfred Knudsen Jr., who was a physician here in Philadelphia and a cancer geneticist, as well as a really interesting embryologist and geneticist named Joe Gall. Joe has been a member for quite some time and began his career in the 1950s. So he knows all sorts of people from the very beginnings of the understanding of DNA, and invented a very important marker for chromosomes that is a sort of standard aspect of research today in the genetics field. So his papers are coming in small batches over time over this course of this year. And of course, the members have twice a year meetings where members speak and they invite other scholars to share their knowledge as well. We have a publications arm. This is the oldest scholarly publisher in North America. We started with the Transactions in 1769. We still publish the Transactions. We also have our Proceedings and our Memoirs series now. That's a series of monographs. So we are still making useful knowledge through the book and digital means as well. We have a very large granting aspect to the society. There's about $1.5 million given out each year. This is for people who work in the field doing scholarship and doing work, as well as people who are given funds to travel to the library to work with our collections. Some come for about a month, others come for a year or two. And it's nice to have that community when all those students arrive. And it's often students. These are mostly either students working on their PhD or those who are recently graduated. And of course, the part that I'm a part of, the aspect of the society that I'm a part of that promotes useful knowledge is the library with our massive collections. Linda gave us a nice introduction earlier. I'm happy to go into that more if you want in the Q&A. But with that, I'm gonna just roll right into the material, which is why I'm sure you are all here today. So I have to very quickly, I'm working on a camera here right next to me, so I need to switch over to that view. So you'll see me moving around different collections in order to show these to you today. One moment. There we go. There we go. All right. There we go. So when I gave this talk last year, I mentioned this item, which is called BOMM, B-O-M-M. This was from the Walter Munk collection. Walter Munk was an APS member for many, many years. Was an oceanographer who worked at Scripps in San Diego, or La Jolla, right north of San Diego. And he was involved. This is a document that relates to one of the earliest oceanography pieces of software for oceanography. This was finished in 1969, although worked on in the late 1950s. I showed it to all of you last year to sort of give you a sense of how important computers are to both the society and to the different people that are connected to it. Without something like this, without the sort of computer software that people were using at this time, Walter Munk could not have been able to do all the wonderful research that he did. It's this sort of really important moment where you can stop using hand-gathered data and gather it digitally. Well, it's a very technical and complicated book, but what it stands for is what I'm really interested in. And I have another acquisition that relates to it. That's why I wanted to show that first before I show it. And it's right here. This is a statistical study of Massachusetts shipping, 1697 to 1714, by Bernard Balin and Lottie Balin. This does not sound like a really amazing read, I am sure, but it's a very, very important book for a lot of different reasons. But the reason I'm showing it to you today is it's because it's the first American history book that used computing power to help drive its thesis or drive its argument. You can see back here, there are going to be many different charts that were created. Bernard Balin was the dean of early American historians. He died, unfortunately, last year. He was a member of the society since 1971. And when he passed away, his family has donated his library to the APS. So one of my latest projects was going to Boston, going to Cambridge, and to his home right outside Boston to gather those books together. And this was one of the books that came. And so these charts and graphs represent the sort of inflection moment where computers are going beyond just sort of high-level mathematics and seeping out into other fields like oceanography, like American history. So these sort of books, this sort of like late 1950 moment is something I'm very interested in personally, and building the collections with these types of materials is something I want to do. And the Balin collection was a really big collection that came through here. We're talking thousands of books. Most of them came in the last couple months, and we'll be sifting through them and making them available to researchers as we can. Like I said, it was quite large, so it will be available somewhat soon, I would say. So I'll show something else that relates to something I showed last year as well. Some of you might remember this needlepoint artwork here. It says here, sacred to the memory of George Washington. And over the course of this past year, I've been able to acquire the print that this was based off of. So this is a print by a man named Thomas Clark, who made it in Boston in 1801. You can see here there are 3 mourners paying tribute to George Washington. And this is very classical imagery. It includes an obelisk, weeping willows, everyone's sobbing pathetically into handkerchiefs. And then one of the mourners is carrying an anchor. And this is a traditional symbol of like hope, steadfastness, salvation, and then points heavenward as well. So the passing of the first president was a very big deal. It led to a flurry of memorial services, mock funerals. There were something like 400 different eulogies published after he died in late 1799. And one thing that was also done were these sort of memorial embroideries. And this is just a really great example of it here. You get the great color by this artist, who was a woman. We know that from the back, the verso of this piece. It mentions that it was given to someone by his aunt who made it. Trying to identify that person is going to be a little difficult, but I think with some work we could get it. There's enough on the back, I think, to make it to figure it all out. But for now, it's still an unknown artist. But it was really great to be able to acquire this print to match this piece of embroidered artwork. So just really cool. And we bought this at auction about several months ago. And so that embroidered artwork is part of the David Library collection that Linda mentioned earlier. So of course, we've always had a connection to the Revolution. We've always collected heavily, but now that we have the David Library collections here and we're in partnership with them, it makes it even more of an important part of our collecting. And these 2 pieces relate perfectly in all respects to what I just said. These are 2 pieces from the Revolution, both related to a man named Clement Biddle, who was a member of the APS. So you see the larger letter there is by Clement Biddle to Edward Biddle, and it's from, let me blow it up here a little bit, Moore Hall. You can see there at the top, 1778. So Clement Biddle was a fighting Quaker who played a prominent role in the Revolution. He was at Valley Forge, which is where Moore Hall is or was, and he was the commissary general in charge of forage. So he was the one helping get food directly into the mouths of the revolutionary soldiers at the time. In this letter, what he's doing is he's asking his cousin Edward to help fill an intelligence need for the army. Edward's mother was the wife of Edward's mother's father was Nicholas Skull, who was the creator of one of the most important maps in the 18th century in America, his 1759 map of Pennsylvania. And in this letter, Clement asks his cousin, can you either send me 30 copies of this map for the army, or can you send me the copper plates that were used to make it so we can print more ourselves? Unfortunately, we don't know what Edward's response was. Just a gut feeling. It must have been, it's pretty doubtful there were 30 copies of that map with his cousin. So, and I don't know if the plates survived. So chances are that the maps did not make it through this route, but still a very intriguing letter nonetheless. And next to it is this oath, which we bought at a separate auction. So weirdly enough, we had 2 Clement Biddle items come to us over the course of several months from 2 different auctions. You'll look here. This is an oath of loyalty, and if you see right down here, it looks like it says 1784. If you turn the back over, it actually says it was 1780. That was just a very quickly written 0. I agree with that interpretation because because Biddle left the army in 1780, and I'll tell you why that matters. So he meant on the oath here, it's mentioned that there's a December 1778 law that he is giving an oath under. And it's signed here by William Rush, who attests to the oath being taken care of. So during the Revolution, each state required these types of oaths. There were certain exceptions in some places. Some Quakers, Moravians, people who were against oaths could sort of get out of them. But here in Pennsylvania, there were no outs. As I said, Clement Biddle was a Quaker, but he was a fighting Quaker. So he was a part of a different branch that was willing to take up the violence of the Revolution, and he was willing to set aside the concern of oaths that other Quakers had as well. And the December 1778 law that this was signed under said that certain people in certain occupations had to attest to their loyalty to the state of Pennsylvania, and being a merchant was one of them. So Clement Biddle left the army in 1780, became a merchant in Philadelphia, and that's why he had to sign this oath. I don't know, it's a very amazing document. It really sort of cuts across a lot of different grains of the Revolution, fighting Quakers. These different oaths are just really, really interesting. And the sort of these oaths, they sort of blow up in the face of the Pennsylvania government over the course of the 1780s. Different people got more and more angry about this, and they were ultimately repealed by the Assembly in 1789. So we had loyalty oaths here in Pennsylvania for the sort of the first 13 years of the existence of the state until there was a large pushback on those. So yeah, just really, really amazing documents that we could add to our collection, especially with 2026 coming up in a couple years. These are the kinds of items that we could potentially display. That's the Biddle. And then I'm rolling right along into I have a sort of section here on the Revolution. It's a really important book by a man named Elias Hilliard. It was a very popular book at the time. It's become quite rare because of the photographs in it that I'm about to show you. But published in 1864 in Hartford, Connecticut, Hilliard went around and tried to find the last remaining Revolutionary War veterans, to interview them and to take photographs of them. He was able to track down 6 of them to get photographs, and he ultimately interviewed 7, but could not get to the 7th one in time to take a photograph of him. So there's 7 people represented in this book. I'll show one of them right now. If I can blow this up a little bit. So Samuel Downing, who I'll describe in a moment. So the 6 veterans were all over 100 years old at this time, and they had all joined the army when they were young teenagers. And here, Samuel Downing. Samuel Downing fought in various battles, including Saratoga, where he claimed to have been the bodyguard of George Washington. So the interviews are really fun and interesting. The men were very excited to have these interviews done with them. But it's also important. It's done in an important moment in time as well. In 1864, the country's at war. This is a moment where we could talk about our unity as a nation during a conflict, as opposed to our divisiveness of the American Civil War. So this sort of attests to the sort of long memory that the Revolution had, and it's at this moment when we all lost the living memory of that revolution. So this last moment of that is really important. And again, I can see this being an interesting book that could be used for something in 2026. So it also relates to the early history of photography, and the APS has a deep connection to that. We were here. We were involved with the daguerreotypes that were first appearing in Philadelphia. So anything sort of early American photography is interesting. So to see the intersection of photography and the American Revolution in one book kind of sold it for me. I'm going to grab one more over here. look here. This is very, I'm gonna pull this back a little. Non-discrete pamphlet, cheap, quickly made, but nonetheless very important. So this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, non-official edition of the constitutional amendments that became the Bill of Rights. So this is published in 1790 by Thomas Adams in Boston. So Adams was one of the publishers of the Independent Chronicle, and he was involved with various anti-federalist newspapers at this time. If you don't know the history behind the Bill of Rights, the anti-federalists who were against the Constitution argued heavily in the conventions to approve it for a Bill of Rights. It was the biggest aspect of the debates that they wanted to have after everything was said and done. And this is a moment, this is where this is sort of culminating for them. So Adams publishing this as an anti-federalist himself makes a lot of sense. So you'll see here, this actually talks about 12 different amendments to the Bill of Rights. And we all know today that there were 10 amendments for the Bill of Rights. So what happened here? What's going on? And just to give you a quick rundown, in September of 1789, Congress approved a Senate proposed version of the Bill of Rights first written by James Madison. And Madison included 20 amendments when he first put it before the Senate. The House looked at this, debated it, and then took his proposal and cut it down to 17. The bill went back to the Senate, and the Senate then cut it down to 12. And these were the 12 that went before the states for amendment. The thing is, the state the first 2 were not accepted by the states, and the other 10 were. So the First Amendment of freedom of speech and religion was actually the 3rd in this one. So we might think of it as the founders might have put this there first because of the importance of it. It was not first in the original listings. And then, so what were the 2 that were rejected? This was, the first was, the First Amendment stated a formula to determine the size of the House of Representatives based on the population of the country in 1789. That did not pass. And the Second Amendment that was not passed was determining congressional pay. So it's stated that there must be an election before any pay raise could kick in this amendment. That did not pass. So Congress was able to give themselves raises until the 27th Amendment in 1992. There are very few copies of this around in institutions, at least. Counted 4 of them. So having this is a nice pickup for us as well, especially with so much connections to the Constitution here in Philadelphia. And I really like how it's just an everyday sort of piece of ephemera, the man on the street trying to think through his or her, or the politics of the time. All right, so that's my sort of revolution section. Now I'm going to show you one of my favorite purchases of the past year. It's a very small book. You can see my hand here. This is called, let me get it over a little bit more. All right. Tommy's Trips, Pictures of Beasts and Birds, with some account of Tommy Tripp himself and his remarkable dog Hero, and of the Woglog, the Great Giant, published in Boston by Samuel Hall, 1792. So this is a children's book that deals with natural history, published here in America. This was the first edition that survives that was published in America. As you can imagine, children's books like this would get torn apart by kids who were using them quickly. I have a 2-year-old daughter who has gone through board books pretty quickly. I can only imagine how this book would have been used and survived. It's a really amazing find that it's still here. The book was first published in 1752 in England under a different title. There were many subsequent editions. This type of book is cheap and easy to make. You crank out a lot of them and sell them quickly. A good moneymaker for a printer. There were something like, I could count up to 14 editions before anything appears in American advertisements of the time. So this was published in 1792. We do know that there were advertisements in 1791, 1793, and 1794 for other editions being sold. None of those editions survive. And nobody thought that this one survived either until it came up to auction several months ago. And with the connection to natural history, it was just a nice sort of different take on the topic that we could buy here at the Society. You can see here in the front, some of you might have seen Renee Wolcott, our book conservator, work on this book. This is the cover was quite damaged. The binding was not in good shape. So she did a very, very good conservation treatment on this and got it back to good shape. This is a scale board binding, which is just a very thin sheet of wood that had been split towards the grain instead of against it. And the sort of survival rate of these bindings is not very high. I mean, you can find them, but having one of these is just having these types of sort of like vernacular bindings for everyday people that are cheaply produced is just interesting in a lot of different ways, especially for people who study the history of the book and the history of printing and book binding. The printer is interesting because there is a Franklin connection. And as I talk about this, I'm gonna just show you a couple photos here. This one's really great. The seahorse, which looks absolutely nothing like a seahorse. So Samuel Hall was a newspaper publisher for a good chunk of his career, but for the last 20 years of his life, he owned a bookstore. So from 1785 to 1805, he was a Boston bookstore owner, and published this book probably to make an easy buck. But before he became a bookstore owner and he was in his newspaper career, he had partnered with Anne Franklin, who was the husband of James Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's brother. So there is a Franklin connection, somewhat distant, but to this book. The book is interesting. You know, it talks about Tommy Tripp, who's basically someone who's very short in stature, but a very good scholar. And then what he does is he rides his trusty dog Hero, and they explore the region to see children if they're being good and if they're reading books. He then sort of like travels around and teaches the kids about these different animals that they're going to encounter in this book. And you can see here, there's always a little quatrain at the beginning, a little poem, and then a paragraph or two about the nature of the animal being discussed. So interesting little wood engravings throughout, which are always fun too. So anything visual, as we all know, is always going to be useful for a lot of different things, both scholarly and for promotional materials, things of that nature. So just a neat little book. I wanted to go back and show The Philosopher. You can see here a man looking through a telescope. The Philosopher, relates to the philosophical part of our name. This relates to science. So in this instance, we have our philosopher looking at the stars in astronomy in the 1790s. So yeah, another one, like these two books that I just showed you, these sort of everyday books, simple books, are both interesting to not just me, but lots of different people. It's a very sort of useful and hot topic especially in the history of the book. And I'm going to keep going with that with this piece I have, which is really, I think, not just an amazing find for me, but the chance of this surviving is just pretty shocking. Okay, so this is called The Comet Explained and Improved. It's an ephemeral pamphlet about the Great Comet of 1811. So there's no date on this, and it's probably safe to say it was published in 1812. The Great Comet of 1811, though, was visible to the naked eye for about 260 days, and it was the brightest thing in the sky. It was brightest in the sky in October of 1811. That was the longest period for a comet that could be seen with the naked eye until Hale-Bopp, the comet that hit Jupiter in 1997. And it was memorable for a lot of different reasons. What happens, like during the sort of height of the brightness of this comet, the New Madrid earthquakes took place. These were 7 to 8 magnitude quakes with their epicenter in what is now Missouri. These are the biggest quakes recorded east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States on record. Native American groups saw these two sort of things coming together and saw it as a sign that that Tecumseh, the Native American alliance builder, was someone they should start following. This was an attempt to finally challenge the encroachment of Americans coming westward. So there's all sorts of, the comet has a pretty long history here in America and around the world too. This pamphlet, though, was published in London by John Evans, who was a publisher of like ballads, popular prints, things of that nature, just cheap stuff that the man on the street would buy. Most active from the 1790s to 1820s. And this is a kind of cheap pamphlet that was republished all over the place, all over England and Scotland, published in Boston. So it's sort of a thing that just got around very quickly. It's short, it's 8 pages, cheap paper, cheap type. You can see here, paper's already fading pretty heavily. Very, very tight type, very tough to read sometimes. And you think, well, it kind of can trick you a little bit too. You read it and you think, oh, the comet's going to be explained. This is going to be a nice sort of piece of science. And it's much, much more about religion. So you think the minister is going to talk science. He does for about a page, and then quickly gets into how the parishioner needs to be saved, and that he shouldn't be overawed by this comet, that it just shows God's nature being very grand, and that if you sort of just don't get overwhelmed by it, keep sticking to your faith. It's very much a religious tract. There's very little to do with science. And when I was looking at this, and I read this last week, interesting read. It reminded me of a chick tract. I don't know if any of you have seen these sort of small evangelical pamphlets that have basically 20-page little comics in them that really forcefully ask people to be saved. And it's just the language, the sort of style, the cheapness of it, the quickness of this, the quickness that this could be printed on, reminded me of what's going on right now today in different fields of religion. So it's one of those things where the intersection of science and religion is something we're always interested in, and this sort of like the tough to find and little known pamphlet is something that's nice to add to the collection. So I think you can see a little bit of a theme here. I'm very interested in things that are ephemeral, things like broadsides, throwaway pamphlets, things of that nature, that sort of provide a different view of the period, or a different sort of a different point of view from a different audience. So I really like that kind of material and try to buy it if I can. But we also do buy all sorts of other, both technical and scientific literature. So this is a book, or a little pamphlet, a discourse on medical education, published by Samuel Bard, 1819. It's a commencement speech at what is now Columbia University, or Columbia Medical School. And Bard was an APS member, and we picked this up at an auction a couple months ago. And one of the reasons I did so was because of our American Philosophical Society members' bibliography and biography project. So this is a project that I've led for the past 3 years to try to gather lists of all the books and pamphlets that our early members wrote. And we have close to something like 1,900 different titles in our database at this moment. And this was one that we did not have. So I used that database to figure out material that we should be buying. Of those 1,900 titles listed, I'd say 2/3 of them are books or pamphlets that we do not have. And that's a finding that's been pretty consistent throughout our work, and just still shocking to me throughout all of this. So one thing we're doing is focusing our collecting on material by our members, especially in those early years. As I'm sure all of you know, that early American history material can be very expensive. And this is one way to focus the funds that we do have on things that matter to us specifically the most. So over the next several years, we're going to continue to grow that database and start using it to drive our acquisitions in the early American field that we cover. This pamphlet is important for a lot of different reasons. So Bard was an American physician. He founded the first medical school in New York and the second medical school in the country, first being here in Philadelphia. Bard was the personal physician to George Washington, and made many, many different attempts to improve medical instruction throughout his life. And this is just one example of that. And you'll see on this page here, this is the title page, it's signed by Samuel Mitchell. Samuel Mitchell was also a famous doctor in the period. He was an APS member elected in 1791. He taught chemistry, botany, and natural history at the college with Bard, and was the editor of the first medical journal in the United States. He was also a senator from New York from 1804 to 1809, amongst many other things. So this book is really great, not just for the one connection to Bard as an APS member, but to Mitchell as an APS member too. So I was very, very happy to be able to get this one. Again, this doesn't look as much better printing than that last one I showed you. But it's very much a book of the American Enlightenment. It's sort of on the cusp of the old American Enlightenment of the 18th century and this sort of emerging modernism of the 1820s, 1830s that's coming around. So he sort of argues for old school classical education, that learning languages, Greek and Latin, will sort of form the mind and give people good habits, that sort of thing. But then he also switches partway through and he says, well, that's all important, but what we also need are colleges like the one all of you students are at right now. They need to be in big cities because it requires a whole lot of infrastructure. You need to have theaters for anatomical classes. You need to have gardens for botany. You need to have laboratories to learn chemistry. And most importantly, you need to have a cohort of people around you who care about the same sort of things. These networks that are deeply important. So it's not just about classical learning. It's about the sort of modern notion of what a medical school is supposed to be. So I started it and I was kind of like, oh, I see where this is going. And then there's a sort of switch. I was like, wow, this is actually a really great text to talk about that moment of change when the Enlightenment becomes something different in the 1820s. But he make no doubt about it. He does end on this sort of moment where, medical school is about helping people, but it's also about cultivating morals and religion too. So we have this very different sort of mindset from this period through this pamphlet. Really, really great buy for us. Now, I'm going to switch over to the 20th century with this document. So the APS covers the American West pretty heavily for a lot of different reasons. One big one being Lewis and Clark, of course, but we also cover, that's much better. We also cover the Arctic, the indigenous people there. We cover climate change. We're just very interested in that as an area for us to collect in. We have several donors who also have a big interest in that, and they've helped us acquire certain things, including this document, which is a vernacular photo album documenting a 1913 cruise to Alaska from California. This is from the Coastal and Geodetic Survey steamer, the USS MacArthur. So this was a civilian coastal trip for this group. 150 photos or so are in this volume. Most of them are really interesting. They have people smiling. I'll show you some in a moment. I'd say they have a quick trip. The sailor who took these photos starts in DC, makes his way to California, and then travels up by boat to Juneau, Alaska. That's where this trip ends. 2/3 of the photos are Alaska-based, and then the last sort of third are from the 1950 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. Very famous for its architecture. Also, one of the last places the Liberty Bell went. This was the last time it was outside of Philadelphia at that exposition. Let me see if I can blow these up a little bit, give you a sense. Yeah. So these over here are showing the Easter egg roll at the White House in 1913, which I thought was really fun. Let's go back here. Go back a little more. So these are, yeah. And then he, this one's, One moment. All right. So the steamer they went north and they make a stop at Seward, Alaska. You can see here there's different images of there's Seward itself right there, a very sort of bedraggled looking kind of town in this period. There's images of the coast all around here. There's Seward. Let me pull back a bit. He takes pictures all up and down the coast. Some very interesting sort of close-up pictures. These all have captions as well, so we can sort of get a sense of who these people are with a little bit of research. I like this one a lot. Just thought it gives you a nice sense of personality. And then running through here, get some sense of the different glaciers and mountains he's taking photos of. And at one point they stop and they catch a 65-pound salmon, which you take a photograph of. And then toward the back here, let's go a little bit further. They make their way to Juneau. Where you can see there. So again, visual culture is something that I think we didn't really focus on too much, or not enough of, I would argue, in the past, and it's something we're trying to really push right now. Anything visual is of interest to the APS and its collections. Let's look here. And then just a quick example of that exposition from San Francisco. So yeah, just give you a nice rundown of the trip. And with a little research, you can sort of flesh this out quite well. And there's lots of different things you could do with these sorts of photos. I can imagine climatologists wanting to see how far the glaciers have receded, things of that nature. We've collected maybe in my time since I've been here, and I've been here 5 years, I'd say at least a dozen of these types of photo albums. So they're coming on the market more and more, and I just think it's super useful for us. And we get down here into my other Alaska. These are the papers of it's a small archive of a man named Frederick Berry, who was from New England and traveled to Alaska to go join the gold rush in the Klondike in 1898. He stayed there for another 25 years. There's just a photograph of him here. He had said he had fallen through some ice and had to run home 4 miles, and his ankles were all swollen because of the 40 below temperatures that he was trying to manage. And here he is laughing pretty heavily. He talks about, here is where I found gold under this glacier. It's like, here's the house I built by hand while I'm up here in Alaska. He just became a lover of the region, and did some very interesting things. So he did not become rich with gold, but he became rich with friendship for sure. He stayed in the community and he became a fox rancher. So he raised foxes and sold their pelts all across to all sorts of people down in the lower 48. So he became embedded in this community up in Alaska and Homer. And you can see here, he's presiding over a funeral of an indigenous woman, he says. At least that says what it says on the back of the photograph he provided. He was kind of an interesting guy. He had a very funny personality. There's a couple different letters in here. Rambunctious, full of energy, really fun. He, toward the end of his life, wrote a Song of Alaska, which was considered for state song of Alaska, something he notes he was very proud of at the time. So he's preserved a copy of it that was published in his little archive here, which we have. Just a fun little item, and it was something like we went back and forth on. So you should all know we have a small committee that gathers to debate the sort of things we're going to buy. We pitch things, and we all want to say well, do we like this? Do we want to buy it? Do we want to spend our funds on it? And this is one we went back and forth on, and I was really glad that we finally bought it, because it just really gives life to a person who would travel to Alaska in this time period and the different things that were possible there. It's a very colorful he's a colorful figure, very fun. And while this might not be something that you could write an article about or a dissertation about, it's a nice little piece of evidence that could be used by a lot of different people for a lot of different things. All right, I'm gonna show one more thing in this, one more small thing, and then I'm gonna end on one large thing, which I think will be a pretty good showstopper for y'all. What I want to do is show you something very small. I'm going to show you this first. So a little book, you can see there's my finger. This is a tiny book, but it is actually tinier than that. This is probably the smallest book in the collection right now. If there's one smaller, I don't know of it. So I'm going to zoom in a little. This is a Quran published in probably around 1900 in Glasgow, Scotland. See here how tiny some of this print is. I might have to bring this up to show you. Very, very tiny. So the Quran has a very long tradition of manuscripts being produced in miniature, but you couldn't really do that with the technology of printing until around the turn of the 20th century, when photolithography was around. So this was produced by photolithography by a man named David Bryce in Glasgow. A lot of these were then used later. They were given to Muslim worshippers who came from India to help during World War I. So many of them were given to people at the front. You know, they also came with a magnifying glass and a case. We don't have that, unfortunately, but we do have this homemade case put together for it. And it weirdly enough came with the David Library collection. So Saul Feinstone, who was the founder of the David Library, would go around to estate sales, from what I've heard, and buy the entire estate so he could get the things he wanted, mostly for revolutionary materials, of course, but then really interesting things sort of came with it. And this is one of those things that sort of came along with an estate that he kept, and it was put in a separate little table. At first, you know, I didn't know about this book at first because our museum curator thought it was an object. It was just a wooden box. So she took it. And then, you know, we were processing it, and then she's like, "Wait, no, this is actually a book. You need to have this for the book collection." Like I said, the tiniest book in the collection. It's really, really cool. And you know, the Quran might not fit exactly, but we do care about the history of technology, the history of printing, and that is a good reason for us to keep that type of book in the collection. We also have several other Qurans, some in translation, some in Arabic. So, you know, there's lots of reasons we could keep that here. All right, so now I'm just going to shift to my last thing I'm going to show you, and then we'll get into the questions. Now, I'm sure all of you, or many of you at least, know about the Stone Declaration article that was in the paper several months ago, around 4th of July. And I'm just going to turn this around. Perfect placement. There's John Hancock. So I'm going to pull back a bit. And I'm going to pull this up a bit. All right. So this is quite large, so I know this is not ideal, but we'll be showing this off in person a lot in the future, I'm sure. So I'm looking forward to showing this to everyone in person. Stone created a perfect facsimile of the original manuscript, the original engrossed copy of the Declaration. It had been fading, and it was the State Department, John Quincy Adams, hired William Stone, an engraver, to create this facsimile, to preserve it. And it was meticulously made over the course of 3 years. He was given the original engrossed copy to work with. We don't know how exactly he did it. The thought is there's some sort of transfer process, maybe chemical, maybe it's tracing. We don't really know. But it's really important because, you know, this is a moment where the founders, those sort of leaders of the revolution, are all starting to die. We know that Jefferson and Adams are still alive. They die in 1826. This last moment. So there's this like flurry of activity. Everybody wants to try to remember the revolution at this time. So there's this big rush to create facsimiles of the Declaration. So there are other ones made around this time. Stone is not the first. There are several others, and they're not made to look exactly like the document's original look. They're sort of flourished, but they all try to reproduce the signatures down here at the bottom as closely as possible. Many of these engravers were penmanship teachers or, wrote penmanship books about penmanship. So they had special skills in order to recreate these signatures. This copy is really great. Stone published 201 copies of this on vellum or parchment. But our copy is special because ours is on paper. So there are only 8 known copies on paper, and we did not know we had this paper copy until very recently. I was trying to get this in order, and I wanted to sort of put on the shelf, and I asked our conservator, Ann Downey, to take a look at it. What does this need to get done to sort of stabilize it? And she started looking at it, and she's like, Dave, this is just very weird. It's very dark. We thought it was maybe not even like an original stone. Maybe this is just a facsimile of a facsimile. And if you look down here, she saw, let's show you here, the white line. The white lines were a little more pronounced. She's done a lot of conservation work on this since. Shows that that's actually white paper beneath. So she did a lot of analysis. She used microscopes and figured out that this was paper. So we have the 8th known copy on paper. The paper copies have only been known for the last 15 or so years. And so us having this is pretty amazing. We were supposed to get an original vellum copy, but we did not for whatever reason. The governor said we should get one, and it just never came to us. So one of our members went to Daniel Webster in the State Department and asked for a copy. And Daniel Webster said, well, by law, I can't give you one, but I can give you my personal copy. So this is Daniel Webster's personal copy of the paper stone declaration. And with a lot of good scientific work from our conservator, we were able to sort of, get to the bottom of this story. It's a really, really cool piece. So we've done a lot of sort of searching through our collections over the last several months, and we can identify 91 different versions or images or copies or prints of the Declaration in our collections that were published before 1900. And I'm going to show you one more of them, our most recent edition. So this would make it 92, actually. All right, open this up. We bought this at auction last month, so it's very, very new. You can see it's very different looking than the other one, which, like I said, is an exact copy of the engrossed declaration. This was put together by, engraved by Eleazar Huntington, somewhere between 1820 and 1824. And he did not make an exact copy, but he did work very hard on getting the signatures right too. He was also involved with penmanship and penmanship teaching. There are only 3 known copies in institutions of this document. There are others in private hands, but so we now own the sort of first 4 important facsimiles produced in the late 18-teens and early 1820s here at the Society. Again, a key sort of pickup for our gear up for 2026 in a couple years. All right, well, I've showed you a lot of things. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I've done sort of quick overview and a lot of stuff. But before I do that, if you want on your own to look at more pictures of materials that we have, you can, let me switch over to my camera here. You can go to our Adopt a Book page, and I'm going to share my screen real fast to show you what that looks like. There we go. And you can see here, we have all sorts of different items that we've purchased fairly recently, maybe 1-2 years in the last 2 years. You are able to adopt it. You can take a look at these materials. They're really amazing. I'll just choose the Indigenous children's books. Our Indigenous curator is working on really, really good work with children's books. You can come through here, you can just see some really excellent pictures. So if you want to be a part of what we're doing here at the Society, this is one way you can do it. And you can look at pictures to see other really great things that we picked up over the last several years. It's a lot of fun, good to look at. And I just wanted to thank all of you for taking time to talk with, to listen to my talk today, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dave. We really appreciate you sharing such a stunning array of new materials. Mm-hmm. We have a few questions in the queue. The first is from David Maxey. Is there an annual budget against which you make acquisitions?
Sure. Hi, David. Yes, there is. So most of our our budgets for purchasing materials to society come from long-held endowments that spin off money every year. I can't tell you the exact amounts that we have, unfortunately, but it's a pretty good budget. I mean, it's healthy. What's nice about working at a place like the APS, though, it's not like a university where you have to spend the funds each year. It has to go out the door, or else there's some real problems with how the endowment is put together. We can sort of roll things over to the next year if we feel that's appropriate. So yeah, we're able to buy. We can't buy everything, but we can buy a decent amount of material each year. But then I'll say this: the budget's good. We do buy wonderful things, but the best stuff that we get, the most stuff that we get, comes through donations from a variety of sources, members, private people we just talked to. So I mean, I got a random call from someone the other day saying, I have some early, some late 18th century pamphlets. Do you want them? So I bought an incunable earlier in the year from someone who was moving out of her house, and she's like, I just need to find a home for this, but I want to make a little money on it. So we negotiated, and I purchased that with some of our funds. So yeah, there's lots of different ways, but it's more through, I'd say, the donation of materials that we get some of our best stuff.
Thank you. The next question is from Bob Peck. Does the APS have one of the vellum copies of the Declaration by Stone, as well as the paper copy you showed us?
Sure. Hi, Bob. Good question. We were supposed to get a vellum copy, but we did not for some reason. So we have the governor's letter saying send it, and it just never came. A lot of these were used for patronage purposes. I know John Quincy Adams in particular sent vellum copies to different people in order to encourage them to support him politically. Who knows? Maybe that was maybe a reason why. There's a William Coleman wrote a short article about, that gives a census of the vellum copies that are out there, and we're listed as having one on that census, but that is wrong. We do not have a vellum copy at APS, unfortunately. And that's what made it all so confusing to us. We're like, well, if this isn't vellum, like we were supposed to have a vellum one. What's going on here with this paper? So yeah, it was a confusing. All those documents created a confusing situation for us to figure it out. So we went way back. We debated back and forth about, is our copy really a paper copy? Is it really an original? Because of all that different evidence that's out there that says we're supposed to have a vellum copy, but we in fact do not have one.
Our next question is from James Hill. Who assembled the Arctic photo album? Was he/she an APS member?
Hi, James. No, he was not. We do not know who the person was. We know the name of the steamer. We know the route they took. I think with some research, we could easily figure that out. We have pictures of him. He actually took some selfies in a mirror. The pictures are a little too small, so I couldn't show them. But no, we don't know I suspect it's not a member. The person in the photos was pretty young. Looks like someone in his early 30s. Yeah, I'm just not sure. We don't know.
Eileen Baird writes, thank you for a very interesting talk. What is on your wish list?
Oh, it's a great question. I have several areas that I'm deeply, deeply interested in. One of them being the history of computer science and the history of mathematics, especially after World War II. I'm very interested in collecting material related to women in computer science. So we have wonderful collections, anchored by Herman Goldstein's materials here at the APS. Herman Goldstein was a former executive, he's a former member, former executive officer, worked with ENIAC and gave us just wonderful printed and manuscript material related to early computing. And we've had others come over the years, but one area we're sort of missing, I think, is the connection of women in that field. I really have taken a huge interest in computer science over the last several years I've been here. I studied the 18th century in my PhD studies, so this is sort of something really new for me, but a lot of fun to try to figure out. I'm also interested in things that are at the intersection of our areas of interest. So, for example, I would love to find the papers of a Black scientist or a Native American anthropologist. Those would sort of add a different aspect to the collection. I'm very interested in the membership of the society. So that membership bibliography is something. All the sort of items on that are things that should be here and things I really want to acquire at some point.
Well, the bell has tolled 2 o'clock, so we'll conclude our talk. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Dave directly. But thank you so much for your talk, and thank you to everyone who participated. We genuinely appreciate your support of the Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you.